My boss denied me a promotion, saying I'm not capable. The next day, I became his boss. The fluorescent lights of the office buzzed faintly overhead as Emma sat across from her boss, Richard Caldwell. The room felt smaller than usual, suffocating even, as though the air itself was conspiring to make this moment heavier. Her heart thudded in her chest like an erratic drumbeat, and she could feel the warmth rising to her cheeks despite her best efforts to remain composed. This meeting had been months in the making, a culmination of sleepless nights, endless presentations, and sacrifices that had quietly eroded pieces of herself. She'd poured everything into this job, her creativity, her dedication, her soul. And now, here she was, waiting for him to acknowledge it. Richard leaned back in his chair, one arm resting on the desk while the other casually held a pen he didn't seem interested in using. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about the way his lips pressed together that made Emma's stomach tighten. He exhaled slowly before speaking, his voice calm yet detached, as if delivering bad news were second nature to him. Emma, he began, pausing just long enough to let her name hang in the silence between them. You've done good work here. You're reliable, efficient, and your contributions haven't gone unnoticed. But that word, the dreaded but, landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every fiber of her being. Emma clenched her hands under the table, willing herself not to react too quickly, not to give away how much this moment meant to her. Still, her mind raced ahead, trying to anticipate what might come next. Was he going to tell her she needed more experience? More time? Another leadership seminar or certification? But, he continued, leaning forward slightly, his tone firm now, I don't think you're ready for the kind of responsibility that comes with this role. It requires someone who can command authority without hesitation, someone with, well, more confidence. You're talented, no doubt, but I'm afraid you lack the decisiveness we need at this level. Each word hit her like a hammer strike, hollowing out her chest until all she could hear was the echo of disbelief pounding in her ears. Confidence? Decisiveness? These weren't qualities she lacked. They were traits she'd fought tooth and nail to cultivate over years of proving herself in spaces where women often had to shout twice as loud to be heard half as much. She wanted to argue, to remind him of the countless late nights she'd spent perfecting projects others had deemed impossible, the times she'd stepped up when no one else would. But instead she swallowed hard, forcing herself to nod as though she understood, as though she agreed. I see, she managed finally, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Thank you for your feedback, Richard. If there's anything specific I can work on moving forward, please let me know. Her professionalism surprised even herself, masking the turmoil bubbling beneath the surface. As she stood to leave, Richard offered a polite smile, the kind reserved for people whose lives you've just altered irreparably, but whom you'll still have to pass in the hallway tomorrow. Of course, he said lightly, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. Keep doing what you're doing, Emma. Your efforts are appreciated. Appreciated. The word lingered in her mind like a bitter aftertaste as she walked back to her desk, her heels clicking against the polished floor tiles. Appreciated wasn't enough, not anymore. She sank into her chair, staring blankly at her computer screen as emails piled up unopened and messages blinked unanswered. Around her, the office hummed with its usual rhythm, phones ringing, keyboards clacking, colleagues chatting by the water cooler. But none of it reached her. She felt untethered, adrift in a sea of rejection. It wasn't just the denial that stung, it was the implication behind it. That she wasn't capable. That she didn't belong in the upper echelons of leadership because she wasn't assertive enough, bold enough. For years, she'd worked tirelessly to dismantle those kinds of assumptions, to prove that competence and compassion weren't mutually exclusive. Yet here she was again, facing the same tired narrative wrapped in polished corporate jargon. By the time evening rolled around, the office had emptied, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the dim glow of her desk lamp. She stared at the clock, watching the minutes tick past as if they carried some secret meaning she couldn't decipher. Eventually, she packed up her things and headed home, each step heavier than the last. The city outside was alive with movement, cars honking, streetlights flickering, strangers rushing past, but Emma moved through it all like a ghost, invisible and disconnected. When she got home, she collapsed onto her couch, staring at the ceiling as tears pricked the corners of her eyes. She thought about calling someone, her sister maybe or her best friend, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain what had happened without sounding petty or self-pitying? So she stayed silent, letting the weight of the day settle over her like a thick fog. But somewhere deep within her, a spark ignited. A quiet, stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished. Because as painful as the rejection was, it also clarified something important. Richard's opinion didn't define her worth. He might have underestimated her, dismissed her potential, but that didn't mean she had to accept it. In fact, it only fueled her determination to prove him wrong, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd ever doubted her. The next morning, Emma arrived at work earlier than usual, determined to focus on what she could control rather than dwell on what she couldn't. She brewed a strong cup of coffee and settled into her routine, answering emails and reviewing reports as though nothing had changed. On the surface, she seemed composed, collected. But beneath the calm exterior, her mind was racing, piecing together fragments of ideas that had been swirling in her subconscious for weeks. Then, just as she was about to dive into a particularly challenging project, her phone buzzed with an unexpected notification. It was an email from HR, marked urgent. Frowning, she opened it and began reading, her eyes widening with each line. By the time she finished, her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from exhilaration. Within hours, whispers spread throughout the office like wildfire. Meetings were hastily called, and employees gathered in clusters, their voices low but charged with excitement. Emma remained at her desk, pretending to focus on her work while secretly observing the chaos unfolding around her. When Richard emerged from his office, his face pale and strained, she knew the rumors were true. And so when the official announcement came later that afternoon, delivered by none other than the CEO himself during an impromptu company-wide meeting, Emma allowed herself a small private smile. Richard Caldwell, the man who had denied her promotion less than 24 hours ago, was stepping down unexpectedly, and she, Emma, was being appointed as his replacement. Emma's first day as the new boss began with a mixture of exhilaration and unease. The weight of her promotion was palpable, pressing down on her shoulders like an invisible cloak she wasn't quite sure how to wear yet. She sat at Richard's old desk, now hers, and stared out the large window that overlooked the bustling city below. For years, this view had been off-limits to her, reserved for those who held power within the company. Now it belonged to her, a symbol of everything she'd fought so hard to achieve. But instead of basking in triumph, Emma found herself wrestling with doubt. Could she truly fill these shoes? Would her team respect her authority, or would they see her as undeserving, just as Richard had? These questions swirled in her mind, threatening to overshadow the excitement she felt about finally having the opportunity to lead. Still, she knew there was no time to dwell on insecurities. Her first order of business awaited, addressing the department heads in a meeting scheduled for later that morning. As she prepared for the meeting, Emma couldn't help but think about Richard. He hadn't said much since the announcement, retreating into himself like a wounded animal licking its injuries. Part of her wanted to confront him, to demand answers about why he'd underestimated her so blatantly. But another part, a stronger, more rational part, knew that dwelling on his betrayal wouldn't serve her well. Instead, she resolved to focus on what mattered most, proving not only to herself but also to everyone else that she was capable of leading with integrity and vision. The conference room buzzed with anticipation when Emma walked in, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Every head turned toward her, eyes wide with curiosity and perhaps a hint of skepticism. Some of her colleagues smiled warmly, while others wore expressions that betrayed their uncertainty. Richard sat quietly at the far end of the table, avoiding eye contact altogether. His presence unnerved her slightly, but she refused to let it show. "Good morning," Emma began, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. "First, I want to thank you all for being here today. I know this transition has been unexpected, and I understand that change can be unsettling. But I'm confident that together, we can make this a positive turning point for our team." Her words hung in the air for a moment before she continued, outlining her vision for the department. She spoke passionately about fostering collaboration, encouraging innovation, and prioritizing employee growth. As she talked, she noticed subtle shifts in the room's atmosphere. Skeptical glances softened into nods of approval, and hesitant smiles transformed into genuine interest. By the time she finished speaking, the tension that had filled the room earlier seemed to dissipate entirely. After the meeting, several team members approached her to offer congratulations and express their support. One by one, they shook her hand or gave her encouraging words, reinforcing her belief that she could succeed in this role. Yet, amidst the warmth and camaraderie, there remained one glaring exception: Richard. He lingered near the door, his posture stiff and awkward, clearly unsure of how, or whether to interact with her now. "Richard," Emma said evenly as she approached him, her tone deliberately neutral. "Do you have a moment?" He hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Of course." They stepped into her office, closing the door behind them. The silence between them stretched taut, heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, Richard cleared his throat and spoke, his voice tinged with both defensiveness and regret. "Look, Emma, I know things didn't go the way either of us expected. And I may have underestimated you. But I hope you'll give me a chance to contribute moving forward." Emma studied him carefully, searching for sincerity in his expression. It was impossible to deny the sting of his previous dismissal, but she also recognized that holding on to anger wouldn't benefit anyone, not her, not him, and certainly not the team. Taking a deep breath, she responded with measured calmness. "I appreciate your willingness to move past this," she said. "But let me be clear, my goal isn't to hold grudges or settle scores. What matters to me is doing what's best for this department. If you're serious about contributing, then I expect nothing less than your full commitment. No games, no undermining. Just professionalism." Richard nodded slowly, his jaw tightening as if swallowing his pride. "You have my word." Though his promise offered some reassurance, Emma couldn't shake the lingering sense of caution. Trust, once broken, took time to rebuild, and she intended to keep a close watch on him moving forward. In the days that followed, Emma threw herself into her new responsibilities with relentless determination. She restructured workflows, implemented innovative strategies, and made a conscious effort to connect with each member of her team individually. Slowly but surely, she began earning their respect, not through intimidation or micromanagement, but through empathy, transparency, and results. However, the challenges weren't limited to internal dynamics. External pressures mounted as well. A major client threatened to pull their account due to dissatisfaction with recent deliverables, forcing Emma to navigate delicate negotiations under intense scrutiny. Meanwhile, budget constraints loomed over upcoming projects, requiring creative problem-solving and tough decision-making. Through it all, she relied on her instincts and the skills she'd honed over years of hard work, refusing to let adversity derail her momentum. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Emma stayed late in her office, poring over reports and brainstorming solutions. Exhaustion pulled at her eyelids, but she pushed through, determined to stay ahead of the curve. Just as she was about to call it quits, a soft knock sounded at her door. Startled, she glanced up to see Sarah, one of her closest colleagues, standing hesitantly in the doorway. "Hey," Sarah said gently. "I saw your light on and thought I'd check in. You've been burning the candle at both ends lately." Emma smiled faintly, leaning back in her chair. "Yeah, well, someone's got to keep the ship sailing smoothly." Sarah stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "You're doing an incredible job, you know that, right? Everyone's talking about how much better things are running since you took over. Even Richard seems different, more cooperative." Emma raised an eyebrow, skeptical but intrigued. "Different how?" "Well," Sarah hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "he's been quieter, more reserved. Almost like he's trying to prove something. Maybe to you, maybe to himself, I'm not sure. But whatever it is, it feels like progress." The comment gave Emma pause. She hadn't considered the possibility that Richard might be using this experience as a catalyst for personal growth. Perhaps his demotion had forced him to confront his own flaws, much as her promotion had challenged her to rise above self-doubt. The thought was both humbling and hopeful, reminding her that people were capable of change, even those who seemed set in their ways. "You know," Emma mused aloud, "maybe this whole situation isn't just about me proving myself. Maybe it's about all of us learning to grow, together." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That's a pretty inspiring perspective. Just don't forget to take care of yourself along the way. Leading doesn't mean carrying everything alone." Emma chuckled softly, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her. "Thanks, Sarah. I needed to hear that." As weeks turned into months, Emma's leadership continued to yield remarkable results. Morale improved, productivity soared, and even the most skeptical critics began to acknowledge her competence. Yet, beneath the surface-level success, deeper transformations were taking place. Relationships evolved, trust deepened, and individuals discovered strengths they hadn't known they possessed. Even Richard surprised her. Though their interactions remained professional and somewhat distant, she noticed subtle changes in his demeanor. He became more willing to listen, more open to feedback, and less resistant to collaboration. It wasn't redemption, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was progress. And sometimes, progress was enough. Still, as Emma stood on the precipice of a brighter future, she couldn't help but wonder, was this the end of her journey, or merely the beginning of something greater? The answer, she realized, lay not in the destination but in the steps she chose to take next. And with renewed determination she took them, one bold stride at a time.